So first of all, this is our Experts at Home series, and I'm really, really glad to have the two of you here today, two good friends and colleagues, Dr. Jeff Greenberg and Dr. Sheldon Solomon. Actually wish you were here with us in person.
Great.
We really died. But anyhow, I really am glad to get your perspective on what's going on, because I think terror management theory has a lot to say about how people are reacting to this real life experiment, and everybody's awareness of their own mortality being raised by this pandemic that we're all facing. And I think that's, everybody worldwide actually at the moment being impacted by that. So I was wondering what the two of you would have to say about how you think this pandemic is affecting people from a terror management perspective.
Go, Jeff.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, obviously, if you think about the pandemic, if this if this disease caused by the virus wasn't potentially lethal, wasn't killing lots of people, everything would be different. We wouldn't be locked down. There'd be much, much less concern about it. So obviously the threat of death, underlies the pandemic and how we're reacting to it. And I think that, the basic point we would make is that there's two different kinds of responses when death thoughts are in or close to focal attention. We're thinking about death a lot. One we call proximal defenses, and they're sort of trying to stay safe, trying to feel like you're safe. So wearing a mask, hand sanitizing, those sorts of things, or sort of going into denial and just saying, no, this is a bunch of BS, or just only people over 80 are going to be affected, so it doesn't matter to me. And we've seen both of these kinds of reactions. Most people, going with the protect themselves, protect the other people they care about, protect people when they go out. But then you have people who go into denial, which is another kind of proximal response. Either way, it's sort of like, okay. I'm not going to be killed by this thing.
Hey, what about distraction, Jeff? Would we lump that in there? The drinking and the TV watching, gambling, Facebook, etc.
Sure. And I think that those things could work in a number of ways. I mean, drinking obviously is just a basic way to reduce anxiety. So obviously we self-medicate when we have anxiety and when we have concerns about death, and we're more prone to self-medicate. But as Sheldon points out, also just distract ourselves, anything to get ourselves off of it. And again, you see this kind of dual reaction thing. And actually, my wife and I, illustrate that because my wife's got CNN on like 6 hours a day. So when death is close by, you either orient to it or you try to avoid it. And actually, the healthiest thing I think is a mix, right? You don't want to be completely avoidant because you want to know what's going on. On the other hand, if you're watching CNN, 10 hours a day, it gets to be too much, right? And it gets depressing, and your anxiety is just increased. So there's got to be a balance that's found. With regard to that would be the healthiest thing, but certainly, yeah, people engage in distraction. Now our distractions are more limited than normal, right? And it's not like death isn't there anyway, right? I mean, people die from car accidents. People unfortunately commit suicide. There's other things, but obviously with the COVID, it's what's salient. It's the salient form of death for us all. And so those are the proximal reactions, and those, of course, are important. And obviously, we'd like people to be safe, not be too avoidant and in denial about it, but rather proactive and constructive and protective of both themselves and other people. But when we're not thinking consciously about the threat, it's still sort of in the back of our minds or in the fringes of consciousness. And that's when you tend to see what we would call distal defenses, which are ways to feel secure rather than physically safe so much, psychologically secure in the sense of feeling like, well, I'm not just this creature who could just die and disappear. I'm Jeff Greenberg, social psychologist, and I write books, and you're Lisa's Firestone, big psychotherapist, and et cetera, et cetera. So we all have these roles in societies, these symbolic kind of conception of the world that we live within, and that's highly protective, and sort of in a way at a deeper level. So the same, we want to be safe, we also want to feel psychologically secure that we're not just these creatures groveling on the earth, but rather we're meaningful people doing significant things in the world. And so the other thing that COVID is doing is making us want to assert that life is meaningful and that we have value. And, the tricky tension that COVID has brought up is that the measures to keep us physically safe are often interfering with our ability to feel significant parts of a meaningful world because we're not doing the things we normally do. We're not connecting with people the way we normally would. We're not seeing our significance validated the way we normally would. If you lost your job or your hours were cut back and you can't feed your family, and you don't feel like you're being successful in the world, then it's sort of like a double whammy. You've got the physical threat, and then you have the psychological threat of your status as a meaningful, significant person in a meaningful world is also a threat. And so you see people trying to reassert that as best they can. And there you have the tension between being super safe about the virus, but also wanting to open up the economy and let people get back to their quote unquote normal lives where they feel like they're significant and they're doing things that are important and they have value and they're earning their income and pursuing their career goals and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So do you want to add?
Yeah, on top of that, and I think Jeff makes some great points, what we have also noticed is that the pandemic, which we see as kind of a real life death reminder, has just like after September 11th, in the book that we wrote in the aftermath of September 11th, we just said, okay, 9/11 is like a giant death reminder to the people, not only in New York, but throughout the United States. And we expected and indeed found that all of the reactions to death reminders that we obtained in our lab studies, we found to be happening in real life. And I think the same thing has happened with the virus, which is an even more potent death reminder, albeit a subtle one, because it potentially affects all of us. And so, for example, our studies have shown that when we remind people of their mortality, they identify more with their own tribe or in-group and tend to be more hostile to folks who are different. And sure enough, hate crimes, anti-Semitism, racism, way up right now. We found that when people are reminded of their mortality, they tend to embrace charismatic and populist leaders. And after 9/11, President George W. Bush's popularity increased spectacularly in 3 weeks among Democrats as well as Republicans. And then we did studies and showed that death reminders increased support for George Bush, who said that he felt he was chosen by God to rid the world of evil. You fast forward a couple of years, and now Donald Trump became president, claiming that he is the only one capable of keeping people safe. And while a majority of Americans were not persuaded by that argument, enough of them were in order to render him president. And so here's President Trump today dismissing the dangers of the virus and condemning the idea of social distancing and wearing masks. And what I would submit, ironically, is that we're in a situation now where Americans who are reminded of their mortality, folks who don't support the president are more likely to engage in the kinds of proximal behaviors that might keep them safe, like washing their hands and wearing masks. I think President Trump's supporters right now are less likely to do that. So I think here we are in a situation where one response to the virus is ironically an insistence on engaging in behaviors that will boost confidence in your support for the president. Here is someone who is keeping me safe by in a heroic and testosterone infused show of machismo, is just saying no masks and no distancing. We found that people who are reminded of their mortality, they go shopping more often and they become more avid consumers. And sure enough, online shopping is, setting new records every day. And finally, our studies have shown that just about all forms of psychological disorders that we have studied in the lab, when we remind people of death, phobics become more phobic, OCD people wash their hands more, anxious people become more anxious, depressed people become more depressed. Well, this is just maybe common sense masquerading as psychological insight, but all of the levels of various psychological dis-ease, put a hyphen between dis and ease because we don't want to medicalize this. But it is true that there's now concerns that there'll be PTSD-like symptoms in a large chunk of the population. And I think getting back to Jeff's fine point, a lot of this is because, rather rapidly, in fact, rather abruptly, like tumbling off a cliff, a large chunk of humanity in the United States has been divested of the primary means by which we pursue and obtain a sense that life has meaning and we have value. I like how Jeff has been putting it. It's like, wow, a lot of us haven't seen another human outside of our household for months. 20 or so % of America no longer have jobs, which is a buzzkill, not only because you're not eating, but because your self-esteem and identity is tied up in your vocation. And then on top of that, is that, of the 20% of Americans not working, I'm just making these numbers up, but a huge chunk of them are never going to work again in the profession by which they identify themselves. And so the very basis of their self-regard is not just temporarily removed, it might be permanently obliterated. And I think that it is not surprising then that we're going to see massive psychological discombobulation. And that's even before you think about the uncertainty that is yet to befall us.
Yeah, all good points. Let me add one other thing. Trump has not gotten the boost that Bush got after 9/11. He got a small boost that has not been that stable. And, it's interesting to think about why that is. But I think that it's to some extent is because the polarization between the pro-Trump and everybody else is so strong that, in this case, I don't think that anti-Trumpers are being moved toward Trump. Because the other thing that can happen, of course, is Trump can become a symbol of the problem rather than a beacon of light, a solution. He can be seen as contributing to the problem, which a lot of people argue that he.
Yeah, well, I think we're at that tipping point.
Connected with death as a solution to it. So I think that, and this is speculative, of course, but we see all these protests all around the country and some and around the world. And I would speculate that the intensity of them is in fact fueled partly by the residual concerns about death and death anxiety due to the pandemic. There have been many horrifying deaths of Black Americans at the hands of police in the past.
Absolutely.
And there have been some protests, certainly, but nothing at this level. And what it's become, and Trump is already using this and arguing with the statues coming down and all that, is that these people don't believe in America, they don't love America, they don't share our values, and he's trying to use that to create a strong wedge, but also a fear. So now you not only have a fear of death, but you have a fear about your entire worldview, your entire system crashing down.
Yep.
So this is going to be one of the more interesting elections. I also saw an ad yesterday about how old Biden is from the Trump campaign. I don't know if either of you have seen that.
Yep.
But portraying Biden as this bumbling old dude who's near death himself.
Yeah, and that again would work if Trump wasn't even more overtly bumbling and decomposing. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and the Democrats are going to have to be, I think they're going to have to get equally ugly.
They will.
To confront these sorts of things.
Yeah, maybe this time they will. It's interesting. I was talking to Dan Siegel doing one of these, our expert at home interviews, and he was talking about watching that video of the officer with his knee on the guy's throat, and saying you could see that he was totally removed. This was totally, he actually used terror management theory to explain what was happening, that the so much othering, that this was like a non-human, that he was treating this way. He definitely wasn't feeling in touch with the fact that this was a human being that he was doing this to, with the other, the bad, the dangerous, whatever, and it's so painful. But it's interesting that he brought up terror management theory as the explanation for that. And I wondered what you thought about that in terms of the police violence towards African Americans that has plagued our country throughout our history, obviously, and but it's been really on the rise.
Well, we can speak to that both theoretically as well as empirically. Jeff's already made what I think is a fine point, and that is that, ironically, perhaps, I agree with him that in the absence of the virus, I don't think we would have seen the outrage around the world and the upsurge of the Black Lives Matter movement. And if one good thing might come from a pandemic, besides eliminating Trump, maybe paying some attention to the state of the natural environment, it might be that there's also a tipping point with regard to social justice in terms of racial equality. But we know, for example, I don't know if you remember, Jeff, who did this study. It was somebody in Oklahoma, just where when people are reminded that they're going to die after they have been subliminally exposed to either white or black faces, death reminders plus prior subliminal exposure to black faces make it more likely that people perceive ambiguous objects as guns. And I think this can help us understand why, in the heat of lots of situations, police officers are people too. And it is, I think, understandable. I'm not defending this behavior, but we're working with some folks in the Seattle Police Department. We want to replicate that study with police officers on a rifle range to just demonstrate that when intimations of mortality are in the air, it's much more likely that there'll be these kinds of existential anxieties yielding perceptual uncertainties, yielding unfortunate and violent outcomes. There's also a study from some folks at Seattle University that show that a pattern of retaliatory violence against people of color in the aftermath of when policemen are shot or when they feel that their lives are threatened. Moreover, the more that Black Lives Matter, the more that's discussed on social media, the more there appears to be retaliatory violence on the part of police departments against people of color. And I think just based on that evidence, and also watching the news, yeah, I think we're in a kind of death spiral of sorts where there's just escalating and perseverating violence on both sides that I think is fueled by concerns about death.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And yeah, we've shown that when mortality is closer consciousness, people view outgroup members more stereotypically.
Yep.
And if the stereotype is, African American crime, African American guns, African American violence, with that stereotype in our culture, when cops, are scared, when mortality is salient for cops, they view African Americans in an even more stereotypic way, which is going to contribute to some of these reactions. And yeah, Sheldon was referring to the shooter bias.
Yes.
That that in general, when people play like a video game and they're not supposed to kill the bad guys, if an African American figure pops up with an ambiguous object, people have a tendency to see it more as a gun than if a white video game character had the same object in his or her hand. And yeah, then mortality salience just exacerbates that shooter bias phenomenon. Yeah. And there's been a variety of cases like that. I think the George Floyd case is almost beyond explanation.
Yes.
It's so horrifying. That was not a split second, reaction. You really can't attribute that to a stereotype or something. That was a guy who lost it and decided he had to assert his dominance.
Yeah, that was Hitler-esque. But the Wendy's parking lot did you see that one, Jeff? The guy that got shot in the back in Atlanta.
Yes, that one's not. I mean, that one's not in the same league. To me, the George Floyd thing was. To me, that was first-degree murder.
No, absolutely. Yeah, but my point is in Atlanta, and again, not to defend the behavior of the indefensible, but the guy turned around and pointed the taser at the officer. And just given what we spoke about, I could see in the immediate heat of the moment why somebody could react that way. And evidently, there's a video shortly after where the officer who shot the gentleman in question is saying, "Please live, please live." He seemed to know that this was a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah, but and that one is somewhat different. And I don't know that every one of these cases is racist. I think that police excessive use of force and lethal force is a huge issue, and that if that could get cleaned up, everybody would benefit from that.
Absolutely.
But minority group members most of all. So yeah, but that was I thought about it as like, well, if a cop pulled me over, why would I not resist arrest? Because I don't want to get shot. Why would I not throw a punch at him? Because I don't want to get shot. Why would I not, take his taser? Because I don't get shot. So, and I wondered why this guy did it. I think that it was to some extent because he had a history of incarceration.
Yeah.
And didn't want more of that. But I also think, we want to talk about the reaction. The reaction has been incredibly powerful. And it's a way for people to feel righteous and to feel like they're part of something of value at a time when it's hard to feel it. So you can get out in the streets and you can protest something. Who could argue that? Now, if you think about Black Lives Matter, there's two levels of that, right? So one level of that is Black Lives Matter, don't kill us, right? So there's the literal, again, the physical threat of death, stop killing us. And then there's another level of Black Lives Matter. We are significant in the world. We have value in the world. Start treating us like we have value in the world. And, and so that's a big part of it as well. This is something like Sarah Becker talked a little bit about, was that minority groups and women since the 50s and 60s have been trying to assert we have value. We have value in the world. We have a place on the world stage, and we should be valued just like everybody else. And so it's an important movement. And yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that it takes deaths in a pandemic for people to kind of get up and start doing the right things. But we're starting to hear people wanting to make real changes. And so there will be some, it'll be good that comes out of this. There's also bad. And I do worry, I am concerned about, chaos and police precincts being taken over and, churches being set on fire and stuff like that. So I think, and cops who have nothing to do with it being targeted. There was you saw the video of the cop in New York who was run down by a car. And I think it's, humans have got problems because it's like, not every cop is bad. I mean, when you say every cop is bad, that's just as bad as saying every black person is bad.
Absolutely.
It's a gross overgeneralization.
Well, in group, out group, but it depends who you're in group, right? And any other that sort is negative, But I like what you said about the two meanings of Black Lives Matter, and I think, growing up in a world where you're afraid for your kids the way that Black people have been in America for a long time is really, just awful. And I know it struck me with the Trayvon Martin killing because my young nephew looks a whole lot like Trayvon Martin, a really good-looking young African-American kid, or mixed kid in the case of my nephew, but that's not how he would be identified on the street.
Right.
And that's, it's just concerning to me.
Another thing that's been going on is I think there's been an increase in homicides in a lot of major cities that were actually doing pretty well, and now backsliding into more violence. So the police problem with African Americans is a bad one, but so is the inner city violence. That I don't know if you saw what happened on Father's Day weekend in Chicago.
Yeah.
Over 100 shootings, 14 fatalities. So hopefully this movement will also lead to some changes with regard to some of those things as well. Because I think that fixing the problem is extremely difficult, but it's going to take more than just fixing the police. That's part of it. Fixing the criminal justice system, that's part of it for sure.
Intergenerational
but has to be other things going on as well.
Is another part of it. Yeah, there's a lot there to fix. Yeah, I realized that we started talking about terror management theory, and we're all obviously aware of it, but it might be helpful for people who aren't to kind of define what is terror management theory.
Okay, Sheldon, hit it.
Yeah, I'll do that. So terror management theory was our effort to take some ideas that Jeff and Tom and I, Tom Pazinski, in 1980, we stumbled on a book by a cultural anthropologist, Ernest Becker, actually two books, The Birth and Death of Meaning and The Denial of Death. And in The Birth and Death of Meaning, in the first paragraph, Ernest Becker says he was a cultural anthropologist, and he said, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And we were like, yeah, that's us. We want to understand in general what's the motivational impetus for most people's attitudes and behaviors. And then in The Denial of Death, what Becker said is that in some ways people are like everything else that's alive, in that we're biologically predisposed to want to stay alive. On the other hand, by virtue of our large forebrain, which enables us to think abstractly and symbolically, we become aware of our own existence, which is on the one hand quite uplifting, and on the other hand demoralizing, to the extent that we realize that, like all living things, we too will someday die, and that we can die at any time for reasons that we can't anticipate or control. And we're just embodied animals, and like all creatures, will ultimately die and decay. And what Becker argued is that if that's the only thing that people were aware of, I'm going to die, I could walk outside and get smoked by a comet or a pandemic, and I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat, I'm not any more significant than a cucumber or a porcupine, that we'd be paralyzed with debilitating bouts of existential terror. And what he proposed is that humans manage that terror by embracing culturally constructed beliefs. He called them cultural worldviews that give us each a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And what Becker also stipulated is that if you do perceive yourself as a person of value in a world of meaning, that's what he called self-esteem. And what he proposed is that whether we're aware of it or not, we spend a considerable proportion of our lives trying to maintain faith in our beliefs and confidence in our self-worth as a means of managing existential terror. And therefore, when existential anxieties are aroused, as Jeff mentioned earlier, that instigates a set of defensive reactions, either the proximal ones to push thoughts of death out of consciousness, or the distal defenses to bolster confidence in our cultural worldview and to strive for self-esteem. And our main goal when we formulated terror management theory was to just take all of Becker's books and to reduce the ideas to fortune cookie-like cones so that we could then generate hypotheses that would be amenable to empirical scrutiny. Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death, but couldn't even get an academic job because people dismissed the ideas as lacking in evidence. They said there's no evidence for these ideas, nor would it be possible to procure it. And so Jeff and Tom and I, this is when we were young and naive. We just said, all right, that's what we'll do. And now we're old and maybe a little less naive, but 40 years later, there's now abundant evidence. And I think most importantly, that a good deal of it has been generated by independent researchers in other labs all over Earth. And so back in the early days when your dad, Bob Firestone, when no one would even listen to us in the 1980s, when I was with Jeff in Tucson, your dad wrote us a letter. This was back in the days when if you wanted to contact somebody, you put it on a piece of paper. And he said, I think these ideas are awesome and you guys should keep going. And it was quite inspired for us because really no one took us seriously at the time. But we've
Nor did we care, by the way, but that's another story.
Yeah, that's right. But so basically, as long as we were the only ones doing it, and that was the case for 5 or 10 years, we think that that work is important because it established the validity empirically of the ideas. But more important is when our students and then other people that we don't even know from around the world got interested. And there's been hundreds, maybe more, of very interesting empirical studies that have been conducted by folks with no connection to us. And that's what makes it, I think, a potent body of scientific work, is that it's now gotten to the point where if Jeff and Tom and I hit the shuffleboard courts in Florida, which we're not far away from, just looking at us, it wouldn't matter because there's a critical mass of young scholars that are highly skilled, that are really pushing these ideas in interesting directions.
Yeah, no, and I think, what your studies showed is that when you reminded people of their death, either by reading a paragraph or, like you said, thinking, something that reminds us that we are like the other animals and we're going to die, as opposed to I'm special and different in some way, that people did start showing more of these defenses, wanting to be with their in-group rather than the out-group, more negative towards people they saw as different, more judgmental, harsher punishment of people that were different, just all kinds of these reactions that you're talking about, to want to feel safe.
But there are some upsides because Jeff and Tom, the Scrooge study, you guys did that, right? So people become more generous to folks in the in-group. People become more devoted to their significant others, those that are securely attached, people become more humble and grateful. And so we don't mean to imply that death reminders are always unequivocally problematic. I think what makes the work interesting is that it brings out a range of responses, some of which are quite desirable. And of course, that just shifts the question to how do we nudge people towards more benign or benevolent reactions to death reminders, because there'll be no shortage of them in the days to come.
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right. I mean, I wasn't trying to say they're all negative, because
No,
they
sure.
are. And definitely, even the wanting to have more meaning right now, and maybe finding ways to do that are creative. People may write books or do things, contribute, all kinds of ways that they might not have otherwise. And
Absolutely. And so, so striving for self-worth is a big part of it. And just as after 9/11, people, everybody was willing to give blood and and also admire other people. So we prop other people up as heroes, and we acknowledge the great work being done by healthcare professionals who put themselves at risk, and even grocery store cashiers still doing their jobs so we can have groceries. So you see those kinds of reactions as well. So it's a mixture. So it really comes down to the person's worldview. We're all striving for self-worth, and we have to find ways to do that. And if the worldview kind of helps direct us toward constructive ways, then we'll see constructive responses. Like, obviously, it's great to stand up for social justice is a way to feel a self-worth, to be a part of that, until it gets to the point where you're setting fires to a church or something. People kind of lose control of what they're actually trying to do sometimes, and take it too far, and become too polarized, and then turn something into an enemy. It seems like people always have to turn somebody or something into the enemy, so that they can feel heroic by overcoming that enemy. And when that enemy is truly, worthy of being overcome, and then it's a good thing. And if they're picking their enemies somewhat arbitrarily, then it can become an evil thing. And that was his last book, Escape from Evil, is that we try to escape the evil of death by finding some evil we can control. And if we just get rid of that, then everything will be great. And that tends to integrate evil. If you think about the Nazis, they were trying to purify their society, and they tried doing it by committing genocide.
Yeah.
And I like Becker's point, Jeff, at the end of that book, when he's like, okay, we need something to focus our hatred on. And his hope was that it would be the truly evil. Why not hate hate? Why not hate poverty? Why not hate viruses that could wipe out half of Earth? Why not hate the fact that we're a decade away from the planet not being habitable by humans? And that may sound naive, but there are some indications that we're moving in a good direction. So I like Jeff's point earlier. It's like, this may enlarge the range of folks that we can view in heroic terms, that you may not need to be a billionaire or a brain surgeon or a professional athlete to be highly regarded in the US right now. Those folks do deserve our admiration and respect, but so do the police who maintain order in our town, and the folks who deliver the packages, and the cashiers at the grocery store. I mean, I run out metaphorically to high five with my elbow the UPS guy. I'm like, you are the fucking greatest person in the history of Earth. And people being people.
I want those packages, though.
Yeah, but people like being held in high regard. And
But Sheldon made a point early on, even as we were just developing these ideas way back in 1980 or so, that these people, that everybody who helps, the sanitation workers, if we didn't have sanitation workers, everything would fall apart, right? But we don't value them. One way our society values people is by how much money they think your time is worth.
Exactly.
And until we give living wages to these essential workers, then they're not going to feel as good about themselves as they should, and they're not going to be acknowledged. And once this is over, I fear that everybody's going to forget about the fact that these people were essential workers at that time. So, you know, we want to see society that values all of its members, that contribute more so than is currently the case. And that's also part of social justice.
Yeah, it is very much so. And I think at least right now there is that focus on frontline workers of all types, you know, because without sanitation right now, and those people have to be brave enough to be out in the world and doing that and taking a risk, you know, they are, you know, and it, you know, obviously also the medical personnel, but the people at the grocery store, it's everybody. And that, I think, you know, that kind of feeling is very positive. And like, you know, like you're saying, Jeff, not the easiest to hang on to after the threat is gone, you know, because right now the big bad is the virus, you know, and it's a hard enemy.
Well, hopefully we remember, and hopefully we start thinking about that when it's time to talk about minimum wage and you know,
that's right,
what people are worth, and try to reduce some of this economic disparity that plagues our country.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. And I also think, you know, maybe the idea of not only compensating people appropriately, but, you know, treating all people more equally, you know, with respect that they deserve. And, you know, what a better world it would be, you know, for everybody, if there's medical care for everybody accessible. You know, I think that's another thing that's really on people's minds in a different way than it was before. You know.
Right. And the justice system. I mean, you know, I don't know what the answer is, but there's no doubt if you got money, you're going to get a better lawyer, and you're going to have a better outcome. And if you don't, and you have a public defender who's overworked, you're not going to do as well.
Right. There's nobody on death row in this country who was wealthy. It just doesn't happen.
That's right.
And that's just really not, obviously, you know, the injustice in the justice system. That's a huge problem. And it's a problem now with the virus too, with the overcrowding of prisons and treating people badly within prisons. You know, I mean, I've been involved with a lot of research that shows that if you actually treat people better and help them get skills while they're in prison, like providing a college education when they're in prison. I know you used to do teaching, Sheldon, in the prison. When people get college education in prison, recidivism drops to like 0. I mean, it's really, really amazing, you know, and we could be doing a lot of positive things in prison. But, you know, one thing that this epidemic highlights is how badly we're treating people within prisons, you know, the overcrowding and the lack of sanitation and all of that, because the virus is just spreading within those settings so badly.
Yes,
it's a horrible problem, and recidivism rate is terrible. And I don't understand why people can't understand that most prisoners are going to get back out into the world. And do we want them to be dehumanized and treated like animals for years and then let out? Or would we like them to get educated and have skills and self-respect when they get out? You know,
Right. Yeah, and help keep them connected with their families. That they do better when they get out. You know, there's a lot of things that affect those outcomes. And, you know, the other group that comes to mind that, you know, with the outbreaks within long-term care facilities and, you know, how we treat our elderly or people who, you know, have, you know, different various needs because of injuries or things that have happened to them, you know, that, again, we weren't treating them as well as we should have been. And that's part of why the outbreaks have been so bad in those situations, because, you know, those facilities were not held to the rules of sanitation and taking care of people properly that might have made it less likely, you know. And I think maybe those changes might come about too if we're intelligent, that, you know, the health of all the people affects everybody, you know, are very poor or people on the street. That's going to affect us too, right? It's, you know, we have to treat all people better. That's, you know, that's the hopeful message that could come out of this if people would look at it that way and continue to look at it that way after the threat of the virus is lessened, if it does. I don't see the end in sight quite yet, you know, at this point. I'm just going to look at my questions and make sure we got to everything. You know, I guess, these last part of what we were talking about was kind of where I wanted to get to, which is, how could people use this positively? Because I know a lot of people are feeling very cooped up and restricted and getting a little cabin fever over it. But how could this be a time of meaning for people? Because that seems like the thing that we could do that would help people to feel better, in terms of managing their fear about this, is how to create meaning during this time,
Well, yeah, I think we're seeing that with the protests and the focus of social justice for people for whom their worldview fits with that. Certainly, it's funny. My wife and I had cabin fever. So what we ended up doing is going to a cabin. Cabin fever. We went to the mountains to a cabin. Change of so if you can, and it's not expensive, too expensive to do this, for a couple of days at least. We just went a couple of days. Change of scenery. Pets can help a lot, and a lot of people pointed this out that your pets can help you in this time. The social isolation is a big part of this. We didn't really have time to talk about that, but that is obviously a big part of it. And so Zooming and webinars, and my wife and I Zoom with our kids, Zoom with friends, try to have some social bonds and some social connection in this time. I think very important. We met some friends and went on a hike up in the mountains. We can easily socially distance. That can be helpful as well. But it's difficult. There's no super easy answers. And if I'm lucky enough to still be employed.
I don't know that I am, Jeff, because you'll tell us next week. No,
after this, neither of us will be. After this interview, I think we'll both be done.
Yeah, don't post this. I'll see if I have a job.
But unemployment is horrible. I'm from a working class family, and my dad literally was killed by being laid off.
Yeah,
he was laid off. Super intensely. Scared about how he's going to feed his family, and it ended up literally killing him. So obviously, helping people who aren't employed to still have income and to still be able to take care of themselves and their families would be real helpful in this time. And obviously keeping in mind that this will end. We don't know exactly when, but we will get past it, and people need to hang on to that. And recognize that sooner or later, if we can, obviously we want our loved ones and ourselves to avoid serious consequences from the virus. If we can also hang on financially, we will be able to pursue the goals that we care about in life down the road. So keeping that in mind, I think, is very important.
Yeah,
but it's easy to lose. It's easy, and the boredom and the monotony can create an existential kind of crisis in its own. Just you lose your sense of time, and you start to lose that grasp on meaning in that symbolic world that we normally participate in.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful to sustain those connections.
Yeah, I think that's really important. How about Sheldon? How are you doing it? How are you hanging on to meaning at this time?
Well, some of the same things that Jeff said. I've been riding my bike. I've been walking around. We've also had some very fine moments where we of late have, in a distance way, reconnected with friends that we hadn't seen for a bit. I think for those of us in the world that have the luxury, and it really is a luxury, of being safe and being housed and being fed, maybe for some it's a good opportunity to take stock and to determine if the ways that we have been pursuing a sense of meaning and value are really what we want, or is it, as Eric Fromm points out in Escape from Freedom, he says some of us, myself included, we get so wrapped up in our day-to-day lives, like we're on the hamster wheel of life, that we don't stop to determine if this is what we really want. And so, I'm on the cusp of oblivion in terms of my academic life. And I've been sitting around in my house and I've been like, wow, is this what I really want to do? And half of me is, yeah, I realize that I'm sitting around and I like what we're doing now. Jeff and I and Tom, we've written some things and I'm like, shit, this is actually pretty good. And I'm excited about some of the things that we have upcoming. And then I also thought to myself, but I don't want to lose track of the fact that I have lots of friends that I've lost touch with. And I have lots of things that I was hoping to do. I've been making noises for years about wanting to learn how to grow stuff. And finally, I've planted like 7 fruit trees in my backyard. Jeff, 3 years, it will have fruit, if nothing else. And I was like, oh, well, it may sound kind of silly, but I wanted to be a farmer when I was a kid. And I go out there every day and I watch the trees grow. And I find it to be, for me personally, uplifting. And so I think that this is a good opportunity. And I think for some people, it's a good opportunity to shift from measuring ourselves in terms of our accomplishments to just, instead of going large, who's Tom's student who did like the humble ego paper? Was that Palin? There's some work that shows that, that being humble reduces death anxiety. And so I wake up these days and I'm like, wow, I woke up and there's a banana. What a great day. And so I think that that's also an opportunity. But I do urge myself and my students to not lose track of the fact that there's a lot of work yet to be done. At the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I think President Trump is the most dangerous person in the history of Earth. So I think it's imperative that we vote Orange Hitler out of office, not only for the sake of America, but for the sake of the world. I think that we need a radical alteration in economic conditions. So along the lines of what we have been talking about, guaranteeing a living wage and healthcare as a right, not a commodity, which, by the way, are originally conservative ideas. The idea of universal healthcare and a guaranteed income are not, Birkenstock-clad liberal ideas. They come from conservatives originally. I think that it's imperative that we use this moment to notice that, as daunting as the pandemic has been, that's like a headache compared to the incoming climate change apocalypse that we're trying to wish away. So on the one hand, I share Jeff's view, this will pass. But my fear from watching the way Americans are carrying on is that within 10 minutes, we will begin to behave as if nothing has ever happened, when in fact we're in a world that is economically, politically, and environmentally unsustainable. And if sitting still in our houses gives us pause to consider that we're going to need to attend to those difficulties sooner rather than later, then I think it would be time well served.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. I know. And the growing things, by the way, I totally relate to, because you both know my husband, Ron, and
Yes.
He's taking this opportunity to really invest in his organic vegetable garden, which is now a farm, and bringing us, direct food, which is, how safe is that when you pick the lettuce and bring it up,
The meals I've had at your farm have been great.
Yeah, so he's really thrown himself into that, which he hadn't been able to do for a few years with drought here. But we got some water now. We're okay, so we're doing it.
Right.
And it has a lot of meaning for him. And at first he was going down and looking at his plants grow every day. That got really frustrating. He has work to do in the garden every day. Besides doing his day job, he's doing his day jobs. He's lucky enough to still be employed too. And I think one of the ways for me of getting meaning during this time is doing these expert interviews and providing them to people. See, I feel like I'm doing something meaningful, Jeff, right? And providing this to people. And I we've gotten a lot of really positive feedback on it. People like it, and we're
Right.
giving it for free because people are hurting right now and they need resources. So
That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. Except for
So
this one. This one, they, you should be paying people to watch this one.
right? It should take us a lot of money if we need it. But I do think being forced to slow down for me has been really important, and think about what's really important.
Yeah.
I'm getting enough sleep for the first time in years, it's that part's nice, and getting more time to spend with people I love.
Yeah.
In a safe way. Yeah. And taking care of those people that in my family who are more fragile and need more care, need more protection.
Sure.
That gives me too. So a lot of good ways to find meaning, but I think it's important for us to hang on when we get back to our busy lives, which will happen at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's always some silver linings. Certainly, I've been FaceTiming with my mom more, connecting with her more and stuff. Cleaned off the top of my dresser. That was a big accomplishment in my own little world. Not as good as growing things, though.
You guys got to come back out to California when it's safe.
Oh, I can't wait. Yeah, we'll be there.
Love to do that. Love to do that. Yeah.
I would really love that. And we would love to have you guys here. So anyhow, I think that about does it. And I really appreciate it. Really great to see you.
Excellent. Thanks, Lisa.
Good talking with both of you. Hang in there.
Okay, you too. Hang in there.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.